Today, we remember and honor the victims and survivors of terrorism. Acts of terrorism create a wave of unimaginable grief. Families and communities torn apart by terrorist acts are forever changed. The scars, both visible and invisible, never fully heal. Through the torment and tragedy, we have also witnessed remarkable examples of resilience and the enduring power of our common humanity. This year's theme is Voices for Peace, Victims of Terrorism as Peace Advocates and Educators. We pay tribute to all victims and survivors, including those who have chosen to share their stories about perseverance and forgiveness. Reflecting on personal trauma to educate others is an act of immense courage. This day urges us to listen and to learn, and it is a reminder that we must always seek out the light of hope. Together, we can raise up the voices of all victims and survivors. Together, we can help educate present and future generations. Together, we can build more peaceful, resilient societies for all. Thank you.
War, terrorism, violence. No one is immune from these acts. We see an increase of conflict throughout the world. And today, we wanted to bring it closer to home. We wanted to bridge the gap between South Florida and Northern Ireland. We wanted to speak about the United Nations International Day of Remembrance of Victims and Survivors of Terrorism. With us today, we have the director of SEFF, an organization in Northern Ireland that's dedicated to supporting and helping the victims of terrorism. Welcome, Kenny. How are you?
I'm doing very well, Robert, and thank you very much for having us on.
It is a pleasure to have you, my friend. So let's talk about this day of remembrance.
Yes, so the 21st of August is declared UN Day for Remembrance and Tribute of Victims of Terrorism. And that's obviously a global-wide initiative. To our knowledge, this has never been marked in the context of Northern Ireland before. And we feel as an organisation that are very much outwards facing, that it's important to collaborate with people from whatever background they come from across our world who share a similar value system. So it's a no-brainer to be involved in this day. And I suppose, Robert, what I would say is that terrorists have worked collaboratively for years and decades in refining their tactics, their policies, their propaganda, and victims should do likewise in terms of the provision as well of support services that aid their healing.
Well said, sir. Very well said. So let me ask you before we get into this, right? Tell me a little bit about Kenny Donaldson and the organization SEFF.
Okay, Robert, well, I'm now my 45th year, so getting on, as they say, or middle-aged in Northern Ireland terms. So I originate from South Armagh, a little place called Crossmaglen, which external to that area is referred to as bandit country. So you will have a sense of the area and the experience growing up. But it was also a very happy childhood. I suppose witnessed a number of instances over the years in that part of the world which weren't simple to see. Murder and death, unfortunately, was a part and parcel of upbringing. In many ways, it became the normal. It wasn't viewed as abnormal by our family. It was part and parcel of what it was to live in that area. But I guess when I came to of age, when the Belfast Agreement was signed in 1998, I was only 17 and a half years of age, so I didn't have a vote in that agreement. But in understanding the content, I did feel very much that there was a huge ask of victims and survivors, and that they were being asked to again shoulder the lion's share of the pain on behalf of the wider population. And I don't think enough has been said of that down the years, that when you already have broken people and you expect them to endure even more emotional pain and suffering, what that does to them. And I suppose because of the experiences I had in childhood, I always knew that this was going to come back to me in terms of such a role as SEFF's director. And I don't see it as employment, it's a vocation.
Yeah. So before we get into a little bit of the work that you do as the director of SEFF, can you give us an idea what the scale of the victimization, what the victim numbers are, or survivors in your country?
As a consequence of the Northern Ireland Troubles, over 3,700 people were murdered or killed as a result of that violence. And it had far-reaching implications because it wasn't confined in any way just to Northern Ireland. It obviously spiraled out into the Republic of Ireland, across the Irish Sea, the big pond as we call it, to Great Britain. And indeed, there were 15 murders committed in mainland Europe as a consequence of our troubles. So there was an international dimension to our troubles. And obviously then when we talk about the injured, physically and or psychologically, you're talking circa 40,000. Then, as we always would say, there's the untold cost of the troubles, the full human cost, if you like. And that's, the suicides and the stillborn births, cancers that are linked to trauma. And of course, heart attacks and broken heart syndrome, all those different component parts that meant that life was shortened. And, that could be anything between 10 and 15 fold what the actual number of murders and killings were. So it's a substantive legacy for a population size of less than 2 million people.
Wow. Just compounded trauma, generational trauma that will last and extend beyond the actual victims of the incident who were physically present during the event. Kenny, I want to get into what SEFF does, but before we go there, I'd like to reflect on something you just said a few minutes ago when you were introducing yourself. And I wonder if you actually catch yourself saying it, that you were actually desensitized to the acts of violence that were occurring while you were growing up. Is that commonly shared in your country?
I think it would be, Robert, in particular parts of the country where the violence was very intense. It's a hard way to put it, but the question you were asking was who was going to be next. There wasn't the element of surprise when something happened anymore. It almost became a little bit unnerving if there was a period of silence in some ways, which might seem strange and counterintuitive. I think, look, we were coming from a backdrop that South Armagh, approximately 35% of the regular army murders that occurred in Northern Ireland were carried out in that small geographical space. A large number of other members of the security forces and then civilians from either side of our community here. It is a huge legacy of hurt and brokenness. What happened, I think, Robert, as well, just to say as well, is that in the population sizes of Northern Ireland, we have a lot of rural villages and hamlets. You don't need to murder 10 and 20 people as a terrorist organisation to be effective. You carry out what we would call signal murders, where someone is picked out strategically within that community, be they a headmaster, be they someone who has a business, and that, in a sense, has a chill factor then for the community to which that individual may have come from. And that, of course, then had the consequence of large people being displaced and moved away from their homestead. And that happened, it has to be said, both the Protestant community and also for the Roman Catholic community.
Yeah, the act of violence under the header or mission of terrorism is actually to terrorize the civilian population. For people who haven't lived through such an experience, can you share with our audience what it was like, what the emotional impact to you was growing up under such conditions? And I draw caution to what you said a few seconds ago, where you got to the point where you would ask, who's next? Who is next?
I think, Robert, and that's a very good question. I think I was privileged to have the parents that I did in terms of our own family. They had strong Christian values and were always opposed to violence. And I can remember very well 2 provisional IRA terrorists who had been involved in between 35 and 40 murders between them. But on this particular day, they were loading a bomb onto a trailer and the bomb went off prematurely. And the 2 of them were blown to pieces. And that was approximately half a mile to 3/4 of a mile away from our home, so a kilometre. And our house shook really to the ground that day. It was a huge, powerful bomb. But I remember my father's response. My father's response that day was, "There's more kids without dads." There was no sense within him of rejoicing that these, what were 2 men who committed very evil deeds, there was none of that. So that had a very, very positive effect, I think, on my upbringing and how my value system was shaped. So whilst there was an awful lot of evil going on around us, we nevertheless were not going to become part of that. And I suppose, Robert, that's why I always say is that human beings, as human beings, we make choices in life. We make good choices and we make bad choices. But we've got to account for the choices we make and own them, instead of trying to slip away from it because of some past hurts that we ourselves have received.
We're accountable to our actions. I think that's the short version of what you said. Yeah. So that mindset of evil is evil, wrong is wrong, no matter who does it, transcended into your current work from childhood onto your adulthood and now leading the SEF or SEFF. Tell us about your SEFF and the work there, because I know that when it comes to victims, supporting victims, you guys don't care who the victims are. Victims are victims, right?
But over the years, it obviously has expanded and grown. And I guess when I came along to the organization in 2008, it was already 10 years in operation. And it would be true to say that the predominance of our membership and users would have come from a Protestant stroke unionist tradition background, because of the nature of the violence in that particular part of Fermanagh would have been principally from the Provisional IRA. But I guess the challenge that I put up to them at that stage was that we can either continue to exist in a mope syndrome mentality, which most oppressed people ever is what we call the mope syndrome, which an awful lot of people in Northern Ireland claim ownership and sole ownership of, or indeed people right throughout our world claim, or we can make a bigger contribution to something better. And that's what the decision was taken. So we then began to face outwards, and an organisation then that first became a comfortable place for people from a Roman Catholic background impacted by Republican violence, to then those impacted by Loyalist violence. And that last sector, which is particularly politically charged in Northern Ireland, is that in instances when our security forces, they moved away from the code and they engaged in a criminal-based activity, then we do not have any truck for that either. And whether you're wearing a uniform or you're wearing a balaclava, there's no justification for criminality. But against all of that, we also are very clear to say in our position that the overwhelming majority of those who did served with honour and integrity. But for those who did not, they would not find a home within our particular organisation.
Can you explain to the audience a little bit about the divisions, if you will, the origins of the conflict?
I think it depends the space that you're coming from, because some people would suggest that the Troubles broke out here in 1968, and that almost before that there was peace and tranquility in Northern Ireland. That's not necessarily the case. Were we in a different space at that time in comparison to where it became? Absolutely. But in some people's psychology, there is decades and centuries of grievance here. And whether that's a real grievance, which is founded on reality, or whether it's a perceived grievance, but it nevertheless exists, and exists very, very deep in the DNA. And I suppose what we would say as an organisation is that the lazy person's view of the Northern Ireland Troubles is that it was a religious conflict between Protestants and Catholics, or indeed that it maybe was unionist and nationalist. But the reality is that what it comes down to is what we're standing on: ground, land, who owns it and who controls it, the territory of this place. And then obviously that takes on ethnic connotations because of wherever you stand on the Constitution, whether you favour a union with Great Britain and Northern Ireland, or whether you support the movement towards a united Ireland, which will be fully independent. So it depends the space from which you come from and all of that, Robert. But I suppose what we say as our guiding star is that there is no legitimacy for the use of criminal violence in the furtherance or defence of a political objective. And that applies to all. There are mechanisms and always were pathways for people to explore those wishes through fully democratic means. The leaders of the civil rights movement in 1972 confirmed that their 5 demands, as were at that point, were all met in 1972. So what was 1972 through till 1998 all about? And the remnants of it still? People need to ask themselves that question. It wasn't a campaign around equality. It was a campaign about the forced change of a constitutional status.
In my research, it's about the conflicts or troubles in Ireland as a whole date back 800 years. So it's been, like you said, centuries. So let's shift the conversation to what you're doing, what SEFF does.
So SEFF now stands for supporting, empowering, fair and focused. And those are our four key fundamental principles. That sense of fairness, which is a different word than equality. Equality in the context of Northern Ireland has almost become a very loaded word, and it has been overused to such an extent that it can become a difficult place for people now. But fairness, if I want to be treated fairly, then I absolutely should want my fellow citizen to be treated fairly from whatever background they are. Focused, I have this little sign in my own office, which I always read whenever I come in the morning, and it says simply, ignore the noise, keep focus. So there's so much noise going on around about us in the world and in organizations, and we sweat the small stuff way too much, and then we lose actual focus on what we're about. And obviously the supporting and empowering, the empowering aspect is about bringing victims and survivors to a place where they no longer need me to be advocating for them day and daily on their issues, that they are of a sufficient confidence level that they can articulate for themselves. So it's that self-advocacy element to our work, which is so very important. And then I suppose, Robert, to say that SEFF has a two-pronged approach, which is very important. The provision of the very best services we can provide, and that covers the trauma counselling arena. It covers areas of welfare, of befriending, other areas such as complementary therapies are proven linkages with trauma-related illnesses, education retraining programs, social support, education programs with our schools, work with the faith sector, all of that trying to have the very best home services we can have. That there's almost like a menu of choice in SEFF, where you have under one roof most services the victim survivor would require to utilise. But the second part of our work, which is the most controversial element of our work, is that challenge function. And what that means is not allowing ourselves to be carried along with the status quo understanding of what a peace process is. It's about being able to question elements of it and being willing to ask questions of institutions and organisations when they fall below par, when they fail to call out terrorism glorification, which is destroying our communities. It's so systemic and integrated within our communities in 2025. That was the so-called price of peace. And many people are asking the question, Robert, today, is Northern Ireland at peace, or is Northern Ireland at a place of standoff? I subscribe to the latter. We're at a place of standoff, and we have much to do to get to a genuine place of peace, and then obviously moving towards full integration as a people.
Did I read correctly that you serve a population of about 15,000 people?
That's right, yes. The Innocent Victims United umbrella of groupings and organisations. That would be the immediate membership, and then there would obviously be families that those individuals are connected to and the communities to which they reside. So it's a significant population of people, absolutely. And I have to say, Robert, some of the most incredible people within that cohort, they aren't people who are ravaged with bitterness and evil intent or wanting revenge. That's not what's within them. But there are many people who do experience a palpable sense of injustice and what I would term righteous anger. They have a right to be angry with what has happened. Very much they do. But it's how do you hone that anger and bring it to a place where it doesn't eat people up. It doesn't bring them to a place where they have no quality of living, where they're merely existing as opposed to having a quality of life. And that's what we try to do on a very individual basis, to work with people, Because I've saw it when that darkness comes over people to such an extent where they can't actually see a means to survive. And that's not something that we want, or we want people to go to. And obviously the veterans community, to which, Robert, you cover significantly in terms of the US as well. Do you know, many times when the people return from those operating theatres and the experiences that they have had, the PTSD and other conditions that they suffer as a consequence, they feel very much abandoned often when they arrive home, and what they are meant to then do, their identity is stripped from them as having been part of a fraternity of soldiers, or, you know, of a population. And what do they then do? Where's their place within society beyond that?
The worst time for me is the silence at night when it gets dark, when I'm alone, right? And for my brothers and sisters who have served in worse conditions, you know, you go from that camaraderie, as you mentioned, to solitude, and often you feel disconnected. Let's have a little bit of a conversation here of lessons learned and what you can share with, you know, the rest of the world who will see this, or whoever will see this, that maybe they haven't experienced it personally, but hey, it's coming, right? We know that conflict around the world is increasing, certainly in communities that never saw violence, attacking of others. They're witnessing more prevalent cases. So from your vantage of dealing with the victims and the survivors, let's talk about what you can share with them, what they should be on the lookout for, and what they should guard against. And I agree with that hate. Guard against that hate. You know, you got to let it go if you can. And I know it's really, really hard, because how can I, as a victim, if you will, or as a person who is under attack, forgive my attackers, or not let that cloud and guide my behavior for years to come? Really hard, almost an unnatural act.
And I suppose, like, that's one of the most contested areas of our conversation here, is that often it's been not alone asked of, but demanded of victims and survivors that they should forgive their perpetrator in the context of what's happened here. And having worked with victim survivors from across the community, I have absolute confidence that the overwhelming majority of people would want to get to that place. But what we need to be real about is what will enable that to happen. And it's not giving a cheap form of forgiveness, which is about the self, which is about therapeutically, how do I continue to live and how do I exist? That's a therapeutic, worldly forgiveness. It's about how do we create the circumstances within societies where people, when they commit acts of horrific violence, are required to own what they have done and to account for it. And that doesn't mean that they are not entitled to a new life post that, because they live within our societies and they're citizens. But we should not be allowing a cheap form of resolution, because we're actually not serving them well either. They're kidding themselves. Absence in Northern Ireland of people looking in the mirror and being able to self-reflect upon what they did and didn't do. People need to be humbled, to be broken in many ways, to be rebuilt again. And that's a huge ask.
I suspect you've been monitoring what's going on in the news, and I don't know what's being broadcasted in Europe or specifically Ireland about what's happening here in this country, in the US. But what advice would you give us, my fellow citizens here in the US, from you who have experienced the level of violence and turmoil and internal strife that your country's gone through for centuries now?
I think, Robert, in many ways, don't become complacent in thinking that these things cannot happen to us, or a variation of what has happened in Northern Ireland happening in the States or in other parts of the world. We need very much to signify within young people that the routes to change are democratic methods, that there's opportunities for those young people to become involved in different ways in which they can voice their frustrations and their answers and all of that. It's whenever people, I think, get sometimes penned into a corner, that they can be vulnerable to other messaging. And of course, we look at the world today and it's largely conducted through a computer screen or a mobile phone. And young people aren't necessarily being equipped with the abilities to discern between what is propagated message and that which is truth. So I guess what I would always encourage, Robert, is that no one should ever believe a word that I say because I've said it. They should go and they should check other sources. And then with their own critical analysis, come to a conclusion around the veracity of what I've said.
But in the digital age, where we're being bombarded continuously with information, it's really hard to stop and think, is what I'm reading, is what I'm hearing, what I'm being told, what I'm believing correct and accurate? Man, that's tough. So let's talk about your role in supporting the August 1st United Nations International Day of Remembrance of Victims and Survivors of Terrorism.
So this event, I suppose, Robert, in practical terms, it's about bringing together people from across the communities in Northern Ireland, but also that international dimension. So we have, and we're very blessed and pleased to be bringing across a young lady from the United States whose father was a fire service officer, who's one of those killed in the Twin Tower attacks, 9/11. And we have begun to know Juliet over the years through her involvement as well in a project known as Project Common Bond through the Tuesdays Children organisation, which may be known stateside. We also have a victim of ETA terror coming across from Spain, and then an individual who was involved in apprehending terrorists in the London Tower Bridge attack and who is of South African background is also coming across. So certainly bringing an international flavour to the seminar, and I think encouraging Northern Ireland people to think beyond this place. Because if we're guilty of anything in Northern Ireland, it sometimes can be the goldfish bowl mentality. And we think quite small in the context of what we have gone through. But it's when you travel the world and when you also look outwards and you see the issues that are happening in other spaces that there's shared learning that can come, there's shared solidarity, and there also is the terrorism scourge is a global problem. It's not a problem unique to any individual nation or group of nations. It can strike at any point in any part of our world, and we need to be very clear on that. So therefore, any policies that we develop should have the involvement of the world. And as I say, I feel that over the years, perhaps victims and survivors have been slow to come together in collaborations to try and talk through these issues and how they can work together. Terrorists never had that problem. Terrorists trained one another. They shared armaments with one another. They have done all of that that has made them as effective as they possibly could be. So if that's something we can learn from terrorism, then it's something that actually we can put to very, very good use as those supporting victims and survivors.
For the last minute here that we have on the screen, can you share where this event's going to be held, and again on the first, and how can they gain access? I know that we will be bringing some post video or video post the event of firsthand accounts, but can you just share with our audience a little bit about how they can get connected with not just SEFF, but this event?
We will also have very much the official UN event as part of our experience. That will be available on our Facebook pages, but it will also be filmed, and then we would intend to add to YouTube at a point in the days that follow.
Outstanding. So there we have it. We have been speaking with Kenny Donaldson of SEFF in Northern Ireland. This interview was made possible through a collaborating organization called Connecting Minds Project. We will be bringing you more about them in the coming days and coming months, and look forward to continuing this conversation. Kenny, from one public servant to another, I can't thank you enough for what you do for the victims you represent and support the victims and supporters. I cannot think of a more noble cause than serving our fellow man. For that, again, I thank you, sir, and your team. This has been another episode of Bets and Badges. I am Robert Asencio. You can find us on most major podcast platforms: Spotify, Amazon, YouTube, iHeart, Apple. And again, on the Miami's Community News website or at www.betsandbadges.com. To the Millers, Michael Graham Miller, our producer behind the scene, Alex Sukas, the Community News team, and you, the public. We thank you. Look forward to speaking next time.